There is no need for an introduction here because everybody knows me here, including my wife, Brenda, who knows Bruce for a long time and certainly has known Bob for a long time. And when I was putting together this talk, it was put together not because I wanted to do the talk, but I have a new granddaughter. Well, she's not new anymore. She's a year and 10 days old. And I figured, you know, I'm going to leave her some video presents. And one of them is what I did when I was 23 and 24 years old. And Bob was also riding shotgun with me at some of those stories. He was at WRKL, I was at WGRC Radio. And that is my Secret Service card. And since then, they've had my fingerprints. I'm sure they have a dossier on me. And I was 23 years old. We took that in December of 1979 because my news director at the time, Lou Galino, who went off to Syracuse shortly thereafter, thought it'd be a pretty good idea for me to get a Secret Service credential. And it turned out I needed it because I had to interview Ronald Reagan. I had to go where Ted Kennedy was at the Ford Mahwah plant. And I ended up covering the Democratic National Convention in New York City. So let's talk about 1980, but even before 1980, this really starts in 1979, in Reagan's case, in 1976, when he decided to run for president. There were two major candidates, and there was one minor candidate in 1980. Jimmy Carter on the left, Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California, on the right, and John Anderson, the former Illinois congressman who was trying to get the anti-Reagan, whatever was left in the liberal Republican Party, who was trying to get their vote. Now, 1980, as history would turn out, would mark the end of the New Deal, of the Roosevelt New Deal, and JFK, and would bring in Ronald Reagan. But that wouldn't happen until November of 1980. The big story of the year, one of the biggest stories of the year, the Iranian hostages. They were taken prisoner in 1979 in Tehran, and ABC got a good show out of it, didn't they? They got Nightline. So the Iranian hostages. In Afghanistan, we're still in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, 1979, when the Soviet Union, yes, there was a Soviet Union in those days, when the Soviet Union decided to invade Afghanistan, which did not make Jimmy Carter a happy camper. So Jimmy Carter is running for re-election in 1979, and Bob might have remembered some of this or might not, but in 1979, I was covering anti-Carter Democratic functions in Rockland County, New York, where the Democrats were talking about this guy as a total disaster. We need to have somebody like Ted Kennedy run. Of course, it's hard to get rid of an incumbent president running for re-election. But that was, I remember, I was looking at some of my old stuff. That was in April and May of 1979 that Carter's problems within the party were manifesting. Iran took the students in Iran took the American hostages on November 4th, 1979, which started Ted Koppel's late night talk show career on ABC. When they talked about the Iranian hostages, that would become eventually Nightline. And the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan December 24th, 1979. And there was runaway inflation. Carter attempted to stop the runaway inflation. He asked labor leaders and business leaders to suppress wages and prices. Bob and I can tell you that our wages were suppressed already at WRKL, in this case, WGRC. In our case, we didn't have to worry about that. We had suppressed wages and prices were down. Carter was trying to get Congress to cut back on spending. That was problem, of course, number one. Problem number two, the credential on the left, hostages. Now, I ended up with Bob covering the hostages returning in January of 1981. This 1980 talk will end in 1981, January of 1981. And that's the other one, the Democratic National Convention, which was held in Madison Square Garden that year. So he had a problem with the party. On November 4th, the Iranian militants stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. They took about 70 Americans captive. And the problem was this. It started back in 1953 with Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower is considered a good president. Eisenhower, his deal was back in 1953-54 was, hey, let's find people who we were friendly with, that we could somehow work deals with, not only in Iran, but also in Central America, and hence the term Banana Republic, because the United States decided to get involved with the nations of Latin America, bananas, Chiquita banana, etc. That is the Shah of Iran. And if I'm not mistaken, my wife actually performed at the Kennedy Center sometime in the mid-1970s, and the Shah of Iran, I believe, she may be able to tell the story, was the guest, but I'll wait until later on. But I think she had mentioned that the Shah of Iran was there. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was the Shah, began his reign in 1941, succeeded his father, Reza Khan, to the throne. 53, there was a power struggle with the Prime Minister of Iran. The Shah gained American support. Why? Because of oil. Oil was cheap. Americans could get oil, and they backed the Shah because he said he was going to do something for America. So in return for getting a steady supply of oil, the United States got or gave through Eisenhower and then through Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon into Ford and into Carter, the Shah received economic and military aid from various presidents.
Yes, I did sing before.
That's my wife.
Right. Yeah. We did a show in the Kennedy Center. It was the Desert Song, and they had Agnew was there, and they had all the big officials except for the president, and it was in honor of the Shah of Iran and his wife. And then they had a big party in the Iranian embassy afterwards. So that was, that's all.
Nixon wasn't a music lover. Anyway, in 1963, after a bunch of years on the throne, he decided, okay, we're going to have some reforms, the White Revolution, which was an ambitious program of social, political, economic reform. It went to a vote, and eventually it would win, and there would be redistribution of land to about 2.5 million families. It established literacy and health corps to benefit the rural areas, and also reduce the autonomy of tribal groups, advanced social and legal reforms, which furthered the emancipation and enfranchisement of women, and that drew the scorn of one particular person who would become a thorn in the American side 16 years later. And his name was Ruhollah Mossavi Khomeini. He was a professor of philosophy at a local university and became or was given the honorary title of Ayatollah. And he was not very happy with the reforms, nor was the Shah happy with Khomeini. So what happened, the government sacked the school. They killed several students, arrested Khomeini. Done. We're finished with this guy. We're never going to see him again. He was later exiled. He ended up in Turkey, then in Iraq, and eventually forming a shadow government in France. And there is Khomeini, who is speaking. That is not 1979. That is earlier than 1979. Between 63 and 79, the Shah spent all the oil money that he got, a lot of it from the United States, on military weapons. And the real price of the military strength was the loss of popular support. So the Iranians didn't like, some of the Iranians didn't like the reforms. And also a lot of money was going to the military. And it was all done with the United States backing. So that the economic progress slowed down. There were no more democratic freedoms, and the Shah's regime collapsed on January 16, 1979, when he fled from Iran, and he never returned. And there's a vacuum. and the vacuum is filled with Khomeini. And there is the Shah of Iran leaving, and Jimmy Carter's problems begin as soon as the Shah leaves. Khomeini returns to Tehran in 1979. The discontent with the Shah becomes anti-Americanism. The Shah would come to the United States for cancer treatment in October. Ayatollah was giving, Khomeini was giving fiery speeches, which incited the so-called students or militants to attack the United States on November 4th. The United States Embassy was overrun. The employees taken hostage. The hostage crisis began. That was one of Jimmy Carter's major problems. And there's the picture of the students taking over the American embassy in Tehran, and Bob and I saw the end of that in January of 1981. Carter immediately applied economic pressure. He halted the oil imports from Iran. He froze Iranian assets in the United States. The crisis became a major crisis, crisis number one, but it didn't last that long. It only lasted about 6 weeks before crisis 2 came about. So it dominates the headlines, news broadcasts. As I said, ABC and Ted Koppel started their show, The Iranian Crisis, which ended up being Nightline. And people started to attack, both in the Republican and Democratic Party, that Jimmy Carter and his administration was weak, they're ineffectual, and the foreign policy team didn't seem to know what they were doing from day to day, and this would start the unraveling of Jimmy Carter's presidency. Now, these are the guys who wanted to replace Jimmy Carter, including the guy on the left, Ronald Reagan. John Anderson's there, Bob Dole is there, George Bush is there, Lowell Weicker, who I played hockey with in Greenwich, Connecticut, back in the mid-1980s at our benefit games for Special Olympics in Greenwich, Connecticut. Lowell Weicker was another one who tested the field, whether or not he should run for president. So it was Howard Baker from Tennessee, Bob Dole of Kansas, who was the vice presidential candidate for the Republicans with Gerald Ford back in 1976. Ford would lose to Carter, of course. Lowell Weicker of Connecticut, Representative John Anderson, Philip Crane, both of Illinois, the former Democrat Treasury Secretary, turned Republican, Texas Governor John Connally, and the former Congressman and the CIA Director, George H.W. Bush. I spoke at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library in August of 2007, which was the highlight of my speaking career, except for this one. This is the highlight. No, that was the highlight. Reagan kind of seemed to be the front runner, but George Bush won delegates in Puerto Rico and in Iowa, and Reagan seemed to be fading going into New Hampshire. Now, here I am. I'm 23 years old at this point. It's January of 1980. And I don't know if Bob Station didn't cover it, WRKL up in Rockland County, but I was there. In fact, the Journal News, the Nyack Journal News, which was the hometown newspaper, wasn't there. Very few reporters were there. In fact, I was the only one. Ronald Reagan is at the Bear Mountain Ice Skating Rink. The Bear Mountain Ice Skating Rink. And there's me, and there's his PR guy, and there's about 6 people in the rink, and he's about ready to give a talk on campaigning. At this point, he is fading into oblivion, although I did work WNEW that day as a stringer covering Reagan, and they wanted more stuff than even our local station, WGRC. So I'm in Bear Mountain, and he has nobody else to talk to. Oh, you're a fine young kid. How old are you? 23. Oh, you got a good future ahead of you. That's what he was telling me. And we spoke for a half hour, and then his aide tapped him on the shoulder, time to give a talk. And he talked about economics to 6 people. Nobody thought that Ronald Reagan was a serious candidate at this point. But he gets to New Hampshire, he wins, gets on fire, and the rest is history. Carter was very unpopular, extremely unpopular for this point, about 10 months, with Democrats, and they wanted Ted Kennedy. They wanted to return to Camelot. I got to cover Kennedy on the campaign trail in New Jersey as well. So they wanted Ted Kennedy, and Reagan was supposed to be an afterthought. And there is Ronald Reagan and Nancy. One of the things he talked about to me, because he had a lot of time to talk, was being a sportscaster at WHO in Des Moines and recreating Chicago Cubs baseball games. When they recreated games back then, he would tell me that the wire would go down and make up things as he was going. And actually, I had a pretty good time with him. I was a captive audience, and I was the only reporter there that night. Bush would win victories in Iowa, in the caucus, and in Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, and Michigan, but that's about all he could do, because it became evident that Reagan was not going to be stopped. The Reagan victory in New Hampshire was the turning point. And think of that, 3 weeks earlier, he's speaking to a lowly 23-year-old kid who's at 500-watt daytime only radio station, and I'm the only one there. So changed really quickly in 3 weeks. Now, underneath all of this going on in February of 1980 is the United States Olympic hockey team. And I happen to, in my career, get to know some of the people, and that is Jim Craig, the goaltender, who was on the team with my son Jared at the time, who was 9 or 10 years old. I guess he was 10 years old. It was 1990, almost 10, 1995. And that Olympic hockey team would make history and would become bigger than the Olympics itself. And Jimmy Carter was very upset with the Soviets. They invade Afghanistan on Christmas Eve, 1979. And it's the Carter Doctrine that comes out. Now, the Soviets tried to gain control of Afghanistan, probably because they wanted to put a pipeline in there, an oil pipeline, to get it out to sea. The United States regarded this invasion of Afghanistan as a threat to the United States interest, and Carter was prepared to meet the threat with military force. I don't know what kind of military force, but he does come up with a couple of things in January of 1980, showing kind of weakness. On January 20th, 1 year prior to the next election, he was on Lawrence Spivak's Meet the Press. Remember Lawrence Spivak? Lawrence Spivak's Meet the Press. And he's on NBC. Longest running show on TV is Meet the Press. Started on November 6, 1947, with a woman who was the host, not Lawrence Spivak. Anyway, he said, unless the troops withdraw from Afghanistan within a month, things were going to happen. A month later, the United States hockey team is playing the Soviets. Carter said he would insist that the 1980 Olympic Games, which was in Moscow, scheduled for Moscow, that the Olympic Games should be moved from Moscow to an alternative site. Kind of difficult in January of the year to move it to a multiple site or multiple sites, or postpone or cancel. So he didn't want to see Soviet Union hosting the Olympics. There is the United States Olympic hockey team, which would bring some backbone, I guess, to Jimmy Carter in his pursuit of getting the Soviets out of Afghanistan. On February 20th, 1980, the United States hockey team beat Finland, not the Soviet Union, beat Finland to win the gold medal at the Lake Placid Olympics. It was an achievement, of course, but people think that the American team 2 days earlier beat the Soviet Union in the gold medal game. Most people did not see that game, or didn't even know it was being played. It was being played on a Friday afternoon, Lake Placid, New York. It was going to be presented on tape delay that Friday night. Not too many people were talking about the United States Olympic hockey team against the Soviet Union, particularly 3 weeks earlier in the game I went to at Madison Square Garden. The Soviets beat the American team something like 10-3. So nobody in their right mind thought a bunch of college kids and one low-level minor leaguer, Micah Ruzioni, was going to beat the professionals who happened to work for the Russian army in the Olympics. But They did. And all of a sudden, that game takes on a life of its own because these college kids upset the Soviet team in the middle of the Cold War. And the Cold War is heating up because the Soviets set up shop in Afghanistan. Suddenly, that Olympic victory became a bigger-than-life stage for those 25 guys and Herb Brooks and everybody else, Craig Patrick, who were connected to that Olympic hockey team. And there it is. That is the Americans beating the Soviets. There's Tretiak in goal, Vladislav Tretiak, the goaltender. And he loses. Mike Eruzione scores the goal in a tight hockey game. Now, there is a tale that the Soviets did not take this game all that seriously, that they were indulging in the nightlife in the Olympic Village. And that was told to me by Norman McLean, who told me a number of other things, which I'm not going to repeat right now. But he said the Soviets may have had a little bit of too much of a good time the night before, and they're playing a Friday afternoon hockey game. So the game takes place on February 22nd, and the Americans win the game. Takes a life of its own. There have been 2 movies about this. It became known as the Miracle on Ice because of the ABC announcer Al Michaels, whose father, Jay Michaels, was the guy who signed the first American Football League. American Broadcast Company, ABC, deal. In 1959, they will allow the AFL on TV. And as a friend of mine once said, if Al Michaels wasn't calling this hockey game, which he really didn't want to, because he hadn't called a hockey game in a long time, the end of the game was, do you believe in miracles? Yes. Without the do you believe in miracles and the win, Al Michaels might have been Tom Hammond. Competent announcer. The Lake Placid game was the first event ever where you heard the chant, USA, USA, USA. So that becomes a cry. And to this day, 40 years later, you hear about it. Jimmy Carter called the team to congratulate them for beating the Soviets. It was only a game, but politically and culturally, it was the most significant sports matchup of the 20th century. And I don't care what you say about Jackie Robinson playing his first game with the Brooklyn Dodgers, or any Super Bowl. That game in the 20th century was the most political and cultural event in sports in the 20th century. Now, the Americans win, but there is still the question, should we boycott the Olympics? Should we boycott? Newsweek, remember when Newsweek was a major magazine with Time magazine, and there's a Soviet tank with the 5 interlocking medals, or rather circles, of the IOC. Finally, on March 21st, 1980, President Jimmy Carter announces that the United States will boycott the Olympic Games scheduled to take place in Moscow that summer. The announcement came after the Soviet Union failed to comply with Carter's February 20th, 1980 deadline to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. So the Soviets don't withdraw the troops, they lose to the Americans, and by March 21st, Carter acts decisively. Grain as a weapon. The United States was going to withhold grain. Who wins? Who loses? Remember when Time magazine was important? Carter increased pressure on the Soviets to abandon the war in Afghanistan by issuing a trade embargo on 2 goods that the country desperately needed: grain, and don't laugh, information technology. The Soviets did not have much in information technology. He also restricted Soviet fishing in American-controlled ocean waters. Now, let's talk about the United States team. Consisted of about 160 athletes, coaches, and support staff. They couldn't go to Moscow. And Carter talking about, he meant business, that American athletes should not compete, and he threatened to revoke the passport of any athlete or coach or staff member who disobeyed this order, because the Olympic Committee said, hey, listen, you could compete under a neutral flag or the IOC flag. But Carter said no, he wasn't going to do that. He wasn't going to allow that. You want your passport? Do that. So the Soviet boycott takes place. I'm going to talk about a friend of mine, Shelley Saltman. You probably know better about Shelley. He was the guy that Evel Knievel beat up after the Snake River Canyon jump in the mid-1970s. Shelley wrote a book called Fear No Evil, where he talked about Evel being a really bad guy. Evel and his friend took a baseball bat to the 20th Century Fox lot, where Shelley worked, and beat him to a pulp. He ended up in jail, sued, and won $13 million from Evel Knievel. Never got a cent. Evel had basically hidden that money, and Shelley, until literally he was no longer able to pursue it, which was October of 2018. In fact, he saw me here in Westchester, as he said on his last good day on earth, passed away in February of 2019. But Shelley decided, we're going to do something for the Olympic athletes. And he arranged a big dinner for the Olympic athletes. It was a network spectacular, as Howard Cosell would say. And he got his old boyhood friend. You might have heard this guy's name. He played Mr. Spock on TV on Star Trek. Leonard Nimoy, whose father, Max Nimoy, cut everybody's hair, all the kids' hair in Boston, in that little neighborhood that Shelley grew up in, and included Leonard Bernstein and David Susskind and Bobby Morse and Barbara Walters and Shelley and a whole bunch of other people. And Shelley got involved in politics with the Kennedys through his father, who delivered votes. But Shelley did that for the 1980 Olympians. Carter did get other countries to follow his lead, unable to persuade Britain, France, Greece, and Australia to go along with the policy. Canada, West Germany, and Japan did join the 1980 Olympic boycott. It was a failure. Again, another policy failure, and there were failures after failures after failures. The Soviet Union stayed in Afghanistan until 1989. The Soviet and the Warsaw Bloc countries boycotted the 1984 Los Angeles Summer Games. Shelley was a part of the Los Angeles Summer Games as one of the vice presidents in charge of boxing. The Soviets didn't show up. And there is a downed aircraft in the Iranian desert. And this was another failure of Jimmy Carter. Failures keep adding up. On April 24th, 1980, a military operation to rescue the now 52 American hostages held in Tehran ends with 8 servicemen dead, no hostages rescued in that helicopter mishap. 3 of the 8 helicopters failed, crippled the airborne operation. The mission was canceled at the staging area. The withdrawal of one of the retreating helicopters collided with one of the 6 C-30 transport planes, killing 8 soldiers, injuring 5. Nothing was going right for Jimmy Carter at this point. He failed in a number of fronts. He was unable to diplomatically resolve the crisis. And April 1980, the hostage rescue attempt ended in disaster. Meanwhile, in July 1980, the Shah died of cancer in Egypt. The crisis would continue. That's Paul Volcker. I got to spend time with Paul Volcker in 2000. He was a member of the Baseball Blue Ribbon Committee, a committee charged with trying to figure out how to equalize revenues among the then 30 baseball teams, or rather the then, 30 baseball teams. And Volcker was there. Henry Aaron, not the baseball player, but an economist, was part of that. George Will as well. Volcker was a big guy. He was like 6'8", 6'9", and he's brought in by Jimmy Carter to solve the runaway inflation problem. Inflation started to soar out of control in 1977, first year of Carter's term. He appoints Volcker as the chairman of the Fed, the Federal Reserve, in October of '79, and he was charged with ending runaway inflation. Runaway inflation was part of the economy since Richard Nixon. And if you remember, Gerald Ford had a button called it said "Win" on it, "Whip inflation now." So Volcker decided the way we're going to do this is we're going to raise interest rates and keep raising the interest rates, and the discount rate went up to 13% in February of 1980. The yields on two-year treasuries hit 15.4% in March. What Volcker did was put the economy into a severe double-dip recession because he thought that was the best way to get out of the inflation. And there was Volcker testifying up on Capitol Hill when they allowed smoking, he and his stogie on Capitol Hill. When he arrived in Washington, the inflation rate was more than 1% a month. The rapid and unpredictable inflation rate, or the rapid and unpredictable inflation encouraged spending while discouraged investment, and that's a combination that creates economic instability and political instability. What was the reaction in the United States? Consumers stopped buying homes, stopped buying cars. Millions of workers lost their jobs. Homeowners mailed chunks of 2x4s to the Fed's marble headquarters in Washington. But he was undeterred. Reagan kept him on in 1981, and he managed to get most of the inflation out of the economy with his actions. That is General Tito. Yugoslavia. May 4th, 1980, Marshal Josip Broz Tito, who was the communist dictator of Yugoslavia between 1943 and 1980, died 3 days before his 88th birthday. He was a Croatian. He tried to spread the Serbs out over 6 Yugoslavian republics so they would not dominate the country. After he died, his policy took about 10 years. His policy of spreading out the Serbs was a major cause of the Bosnian War in the 1990s. The World Health Organization on May 8th of 1980 announced that smallpox had been eradicated from the wild. No more smallpox, although they still have some virus sitting around somewhere under lock and key. Bruce, you were there. I think you got the scoop you were telling me. This is Mount St. Helens in 1992, and I'm going to open up for Bruce in 1 second because I know he was there, or he had the story. On May 18th, at 8:32 a.m., Mount St. Helens in Washington erupted. It burst 3 times in 24 hours. After rumbling for 2 months, left 57 people dead or missing. The mountain lost 1,300 feet of elevation and gained a 2 mile long, and 1 mile wide crater. Bruce, you were telling a story the other day about, your mic is on, if you're there.
Yes, I'm there.
Yeah, what you were telling a story about how you got that scoop.
Yes, I was sitting home at about noon that day, noon Pacific time, and I got a call from the program director at my radio station, KEED, in Eugene, Oregon. And he said, get your ass down to the station. Mount St. Helens blew. We need updates. So I was sitting there in the newsroom, and an hour or 2 later, the newsroom hotline rang, and it was the proprietor of kind of a skanky motel in Eugene on 6th Avenue, which was known in Eugene as Felony Flats. But anyway, that motel was the home to a whole bunch of U.S. Forest Service workers. Why they were based in Eugene and working at Mount St. Helens over 2 hours away, I have no idea. But that's where they were staying. And the proprietor of the motel said, there are a bunch of guys who were on the mountain when it blew up today. Thought you'd like to know. They're standing around here in our parking lot. So in about 10 minutes, I was over there interviewing them. And the only other local media there was KEZI Channel 9, which was the ABC affiliate. And the reporter there was one Lisa Stark, who went on to go from Eugene to KGO in San Francisco, and from KGO to ABC News. And so she was working for ABC in Washington for quite some time, but she was the only other media there, and she kind of frowned when she saw me arrive because now she was not the only person to talk to these people. But she was the only TV station there. Anyway, I got a bunch of interviews with these guys, and it remains to this day the best audio I've ever gotten. These guys, when I spoke to them, they spoke as if they were on the mountain 5 minutes ago. And their eyes got as big as saucers. They said the ground shook, the sky turned black. We thought the world was coming to an end. It was great stuff. I went back and used this quite obviously on updates, but I also sent it to ABC Radio because we were an ABC affiliate. And apparently they thought the tape was pretty good too, because one of the managers on the news side, a woman named Tina Press, who went on to work, I think, for Channel 4. She left ABC Radio and worked for Channel 4 in some management capacity. She sent me a personal letter saying that ABC loved it and that I did a great job and blah, blah, blah. But that's the story of the best tape I've ever gotten.
At St Helens 40 years ago. 40 years ago at Quebec, again, they're in the separatist movement. It was in the 1960s, some militants who ended up in jail because there was a series of mailbox bombing. They decided, let's try to do it with the voters, and they failed in 1980 to do it with the voters. That would come up again in 1994-95. The
Kevin, that
referendum,
picture,
yeah,
the picture of that cannon,
yeah,
I'm going to take a guess as to where that is.
Yeah.
That's right outside Hotel Frontenac in Quebec City.
you got it. That's where it is. So May 20th, 1980, Canada and Quebec says no to separatism. And that's laid low for the last 25 years. I guess right now, everybody is not doing, well, there's not too much going on there. It's laying rather low, the separatist movement in Canada for Quebec. This is CNN, 40th anniversary of CNN. I'm there in the middle. And Bruce is there, right there with the ESPN mic flag right in front of Bruce bending down. And I'm next to Harvey Meyerson, who is
Right.
the United States Football League attorney. This was the trial against, with the NFL and the USFL suing the NFL, winning but not getting any money. So Bruce and I were there together. But the only reason I put the picture there, other than to show that I was there, was that CNN, and I think that was Jamie Morrison at that point, who was with CNN.
Dan Patrick.
Was it Dan? Was it Dan
Yes.
at that point? Jamie came after that. Anyways, 40 years ago, CNN debuted, and it was not something that was well received. Nobody wanted to invest in Ted Turner in CNN because they thought it was just a waste of money and they were going to lose money. Meanwhile, Ted Turner was rolling the dice, saying, hey, this is going to last. We're not going to be signing off until the world ends. We will be on and we will cover the end of the world live, and that will be our last event. We'll play Nearer My God to Thee before we sign off. Now, there is a video that does exist because people within CNN, friends of mine, like Jeff Grimshaw, said they have seen this video of Ted Turner in 1980 imitating Porky Pig in the last thing that was supposed to be on CNN. That's all, folks. CNN was losing $1 million a month at that point, and as were a lot of other people. One of the reasons CNN was in Atlanta instead of New York, because all the New York banks would not fund them. The banks in Chicago decided to roll the dice on them, and Turner decided CNN should be based in Atlanta because nobody in New York believed in them, because nobody thought it would work. It was a sure money loser, as was ESPN back in those days, and the Weather Channel. And there is Ted on the first day of CNN. Now, Ted does get a gift from Ronald Reagan, the passage of the Cable TV Act of 1984, and that more than likely saved CNN along with TBS and other non-Turner properties such as ESPN, the Weather Channel, the cable TV networks, whether it was TBS, WTBS, CNN, ESPN, the Weather Channel, were rolled into a bundle, into a basic expanded package. And if you wanted that as a cable consumer, you had to buy the basic tier and then you bought the other tier. That is what saved all of those companies from going out of business when Ronald Reagan kind of socialized cable television. But back in those days, I remember my cable bill was just $17. The bundling concept socialized cable TV. and made cable TV what it is today, because it was not going all that well unless you had a service such as Sports Channel, which you paid $10 a month to see, to get hockey games and basketball games in the New York area. And that guy in the middle is Harvey Schiller. That was in 2002. Harvey was one of Ted's main lieutenants with Turner Sports. Harvey would slip back and forth between working for George Steinbrenner and also Ted Turner. Harvey is a protege of my friend Shelley Saltman. Shelley should be here. He would be having such a good time listening to me as we talk. By the way, that night I met Miss World 2001 that night. Turner's company built a portfolio of cable television news and entertainment brands, would eventually include CNN, Headline News, CNN International, TNT, Cartoon Network, which was run by my friend, the late Jack Kelly, who also ran the Goodwill Games in 1994, which Bruce remembers. Turner Classic Movies in the 1990s, Castle Rock Entertainment, and New Line Cinema became Turner Broadcasting Properties. Castle Rock Entertainment was a partner in the Seinfeld show. In October of '96, the company merged with Time Warner. And Ted was kind of kicked out by that point. 2001, Time Warner merged with AOL to become AOL Time Warner. That didn't work. The company later changed its name back to Time Warner. AT&T has bought Time Warner, and AOL is now owned by Verizon, which also owns Yahoo. Ronald Reagan would get the nomination in 1980 at the party in Detroit, July 16th, 1980. And I was at the Democratic National Convention on August 11th through 14th, there every night, Madison Square Garden, heard Ted Kennedy's Goodbye to America speech as a presidential candidate there, and Carter accepting his the nomination for a second term along with Walter Mondale, and that was on August 14th, 1980. That is Lech Walesa. 1980 is chock full of things. On August 14th, as Jimmy Carter is renominated, 17,000 workers seized control of the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, Poland. They were protesting, among other things, a recent rise in food prices. The leader of Solidarity, Lech Walesa, had narrowly avoided arrest by secret police that morning. He scaled the shipyard gate, joined the workers inside. The workers in 20 other factories joined the strike in solidarity. And there they are, back in 1980, in solidarity. 17 days later, Poland's communist government and Walesa appeared before the workers in the shipyard with an historic message. We have an independent, self-governing trade union. We have the right to strike. That was a Soviet bloc country, a Warsaw Pact country, Poland in 1980. That's Saddam Hussein, who was around in 1980 because the Iran-Iraq war starts on September 22nd after Hussein ordered his forces to invade Western Iran. The fighting between the two countries continued until 1988. They signed the ceasefire then. Carter and Reagan had a bunch of debates, and we're coming up to election day. And Carter has all these problems: double-digit inflation, rising unemployment, the crisis in Iran, the Cold War, Soviet Union, Afghanistan. He also has unpopular stances on the need for energy conservation. If you remember, he wore a sweater in the White House saying, "Wear a sweater." He also put solar panels on the White House, which Reagan immediately removed as he got there. And there was doubts about his competence and that of the people around him. Reagan talked about the communist threat abroad, which he told me in January of that year, and the dire effects that big government was having on the country's economy. But the fact of the matter is, and I listened back to the Reagan tape I had when I interviewed him, he didn't spell out any remedies. All he said is, this is this, this is this, this is this, this is this, and we're going to cut your taxes. That is all he said. Which led me to believe back in 1980 as a 24-year-old that I could run a bread box for president. All I had to do is get the bread box popular, throw out a couple of slogans, and sell it as advertising. That is all you have to do, and that's how politics runs. You sell a brand, you sell a perceived perception, as Mel Karmazin once told me. You perceive this perception. It might be real, it might not be real, but this is what you perceive, and this is your perception, and that's what you have your emotions upon. And many people had their emotions put on Ronald Reagan that he was gonna solve all the problems, and Reagan would be elected president, and there he is with Nancy, and he would win in 1980 on November 4th by a landslide. And the term Reagan Democrats comes out of this because he made major inroads in traditional Democratic areas and coalitions, and he won virtually every region of the country. Carter carried 6 states and the District of Columbia. John Anderson, the Illinois congressman who was running as an independent, probably took some votes away from Jimmy Carter, but Reagan was going to win. Jimmy Carter was painted as weak. He didn't solve the inflation problem. Hostages were still in Iran. Soviets still in Afghanistan. He didn't solve any of that, and the energy crisis was always in the background. Now, after the election, with the assistance of Algerian intermediaries, negotiators began to free the hostages. On January 20th, the day of Reagan's inauguration, the United States released $8 billion in Iranian assets. The hostages were freed after 444 days in Iranian detention. The agreement gave Iran immunity from lawsuits arising from the incident. And before I get into there, John Lennon was assassinated by that man there, Mark Chapman. He's giving Lennon an autograph in New York, December 8th, 1980, shot in the archway of the Dakotas, where Rosemary, no, The Exorcist, or was it Rosemary's Baby? Anyway, that was, the Dakota was used as the exterior in that movie. Chapman said he was incensed by Lennon's lifestyle, his public statements, this 1966 remark about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus, and the lyrics of later songs such as God and Imagine. He also was inspired by the fictional character Holden Caulfield from J.D. Salinger's novel The Catcher in the Rye, a book which I'm sure that Effie has in the Roseland Library. Some of the things that you saw in 1980, the Rubik's Cube comes about in 1980. It makes its debut at a toy fair in London. It was created by Erno Rubik in the 1970s, patented as the Magic Cube in Hungary. The Magic Cube was picked up by Ideal Toys in the United States, and they developed a toy for a global market. You know what that is? That's a Post-it. Post-its introduced to stores in April. It was as you know, a square yellow notepad. It was lightweight, had sticky adhesive strip on the back, making it removable. It was a product that was created by 3M, by scientists Spencer Silver and Art Fry. And they created the adhesive tape, and then Fry came up with the idea, hey, let's put that on that little piece of paper, and you have a Post-it. Pac-Man. Pac-Man comes out in 1980. It was released by Namco. The original Japanese title was Puck-Man. It was changed to Pac-Man for international releases because, well, they were worried that if it still was Pac-Man, somebody might deface the arcade by changing the P to an F, and that was one of George Carlin's words you couldn't say on TV, so it became Pac-Man instead of Puck-Man. Ronald Reagan is sworn in, President of the United States, on January 20th, 1981, as we spill over into 1981. And the thing on the left, and Bob Lemolek has one of those things. Bob, once you got a book that Effie might want in the library. You want to plug your book, because I know that part of that was in your book.
The book itself, if anybody in Rockland County or New Jersey can get the book from the local library, called the Newsroom Confessions. So that's some of the interesting stuff is in there. But Newsroom Confessions is mainly 1981, which was just an interesting a year. And also I put it with a lot of was more of a comedy, and what radio was like back in those days, very, very foreign to what it's like today. So I mean, if you want to enjoy a book and and I got a lot of great reviews. I would say maybe get like 30 odd great reviews from even total strangers, or someone like Bill Deal got in touch with me. Said, "Gee, I just read your book. I loved it." And I didn't even know I knew Bill Deal. So it's like that sort of thing was great. But on the bottom line, it's not that it matters, but I probably could have made more money bagging groceries. It's just like the old days,
Yeah. I'm in that book. So
yeah, you're in that book.
I'm in that book. So and Bob and I rode shotgun up to Stewart Air Force Base on a cold and windy Sunday afternoon. And Bob and I go up to West Point together, and we think we're going to interview the hostages. Remember, Bob? And there was a guy who comes on the bus, and he's got the buzz cut, and he's got the thing in his ear. You guys are not going to, and he's giving us well, hey, you just wasted your time because you're not going to see any of these people. They're going to be on the bus, and we're going to get them before you could get them. So that's
we had the visual of the bus driving past us, and they were we could see them in the bus. But you're right, we never got to talk to them.
But we did get to go out, and we did interview some people waving their flags in the 2 degrees. I think it was 80. It was on Route 84, wasn't it? Up there that we talked to people, or one of the main roads, maybe 52.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Yeah, but Bob and I were up there, and so anyway, they land at Stewart Air Force Base, and we're there. We never see them. In 2000, the former hostages and their survivors sued Iran under the 1996 Anti-Terrorism Act, which permitted United States students to sue foreign governments in cases of state-sponsored terrorism. The following year, they won the lawsuit, but Iran did not offer a defense, so they got nothing. The United States State Department sought the dismissal of the suit, arguing it would hinder its ability to negotiate international agreements, and the federal judge dismissed the plaintiff's suit for damages in 2002, ruling that the agreement that resulted in their release barred awarding any damages.
Like the United States Football League, how much money they got?
They got $3.
Same $3.
$3. Anyway, after 1980, well, the war continues between Iran and Iraq. That would end in 1988 with a ceasefire. The United Nations mediated that case. The resumption of normal diplomatic relations and withdrawal of troops did not take place until the formal peace agreement, August 16, 1990. Lech Walesa, he becomes the president of Poland in December 1990. He was the founder of the Solidarity Trade Union. He won a landslide election victory, becoming the first directly elected leader of Poland. And this is a guy who I ended up owning for the last 40 years as an acquaintance. That is Alphonse D'Amato. That's me with him 10 years ago at a party at the St. Regis Hotel for the president of Malaysia. Howard Cosell, I think I won his respect. He was asking me all kinds of stuff on me, Cosell, about my background. And I told him, I covered news, and we talked about 1980. And he said, I was thinking of running for Senate in 1980, state of New York. He never would have won. Huh? He looked at me like, how could you tell Howard Cosell no? And I said, I'm going to tell you why you were never going to win. Because Jake Javits, who he knew, Jacob Javits, longtime senator, Republican/liberal, well, he would lose the nomination to Alphonse D'Amato for Senate in New York, but he kept the liberal line. And Liz Holtzman, who is the Democratic nominee, was counting on getting that liberal line. Now, Javits had ALS at the time, Lou Gehrig's disease, as it was called in those days, and refused to give up the line. And I told Howard, I said, he had that liberal line. I don't know how many votes the liberal line, 17, 18%, but that was enough to take away from Elizabeth Holtzman. And I said, I'm not sure that you would have, Bess Meyerson was in that race. Carol Bellamy was in that race. Elizabeth Holtzman was in that race. and Elizabeth Holtzman would get the nomination. I said, you, even though you had your cachet from TV, were not part of the Democratic establishment, which that was a very inside thing. And Howard accepted that, probably because I talked to him about Jacob Javits. I gave Alphonse D'Amato his first non-Nassau County interview running for Senate at WGRC. Now, WGRC, I'm going to leave you with this last story, was in trailers. We were in trailers with a portisand behind a place that sold tombstones. And you had to come in and gravel road, and we were never sure if our paychecks were going to clear or not. So he comes in, we had scheduled this interview, and I said, listen, he was the Hempstead town supervisor at the time, which is, you know, just a little office at the time, although he had the Nassau County Republican Party machine behind him. I said, I got to go cash my check. He waited for me. Then we did a half-hour interview. And we talked afterwards, and for the last 40 years, although I haven't seen him in a long time, Alphonse D'Amato and I have had a relationship. I'll tell you one other thing about Alphonse D'Amato in closing. No politician ever told a dirty joke better than Alphonse D'Amato. Any questions, any comments? And thank you, Effie, for inviting me tonight. Questions, comments?
Oh, you're welcome.
Well, I hope you enjoyed Bruce and Bob as well, bringing something to the table here. Normally, I don't have people doing that, but they're old friends of mine, and we have run together for a very long time. I've known Bob. Well, I've known you 42 years, Bob, since 1978.
Yeah, 78 sounds right.
78. I've known Bruce since what, about 1984?
84, exactly.
Yeah, 1984. So they're old friends of mine. We ran together for a long time and covering stories. Bruce and I ran the streets of Manhattan for a very long time, covering sports. And Bob and I covered news for a very long time. And I want to thank them for helping out here. And telling some of these old stories that my granddaughter, when she is of age, will enjoy. That's my hope anyway, that she will enjoy that at some point when she gets to the point where she can understand all that. And I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Carl, for coming. And I have, if I'm allowed to, I wanted Bruce. Bruce is involved in a project right now that you might want to, it's about cancer, that you might want to give him, do him a favor.
Oh, thanks, Evan. I am part of a newly established website podcast called cancerinterviews.com. And basically what we do is we feature lengthy interviews with people who are cancer survivors, and in a few rare cases, caregivers for cancer survivors. And we're always looking for people who might want to appear on our podcast. These would be people who have A, beaten cancer, and B, are enthusiastic about talking about their cancer journey. As many times when people are diagnosed with cancer, they get on the internet, they talk to different healthcare professionals, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also an emotional piece to this, and we feel, and we've gotten great feedback that it also means a lot for somebody who's been freshly diagnosed to hear about the cancer experience in lay terms from lay people. So that's basically what we do. The favor that we're asking is if you would go to cancerinterviews.com, and you'll see in the upper right-hand corner on our homepage, you will see the link for YouTube. And if you would simply click on the YouTube link, and then there is a little red box where it says subscribe. And if you would hit subscribe, that gets us closer to the 100 subscriber mark. And Evan can back me up on this. When you get to the 100 subscriber mark, then through YouTube, you have your own link. Right now, until we get to 100, we're like 37 different numbers, letters, and punctuation marks. So that whole operation would take about a minute or less. Again, go to cancerinterviews.com, the YouTube link, and then hit subscribe. And if anybody could do that, that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks, and thanks, Evan.
Okay, anybody have any, Effie, thank you so much. We'll be talking, and thank you for helping link to other talks that I do as well. And I got a good one on Friday about the politics of sports business, which I'll send you the link to. Thank you so much. Carl, thank you for coming again. And Bob, thank you for your contribution. From 40 years ago, actually 39 and a half years ago, Bob and I literally had a seat to history. We witnessed history that day with the hostages coming back. And that's one of even though we didn't do anything, we were stopped in our tracks. We couldn't do anything in terms of reporting because we didn't have a chance. But that's one of the highlights, one of the better stories I did anyway, and I know Bob has it in the book. Anyway, thank you everybody so much. Thank you, Effie. And thank you everybody else for showing up. I appreciate it. And we'll give this to Effie and then put it on the website so more people could see it. And we'll talk soon. Thank you so much.